I'm Lawrence Schick. I've been designing role-playing games for a long time. In fact, I started playing and running D&D within a few months after it was first released in 1974, and played it and many other games, run many other games ever since. I went into video games in the early 80s and have worked on and off in all sorts of games, mostly narrative games, but not exclusively. My most recent gig was as principal narrative designer on Baldur's Gate 3. And I'm still at Larian Studios working on the next project. I'm going to run through some of what I think are the useful lessons from BG3 that can apply to tabletop role-playing, because it's very much a game with its roots in TTRPGs. Obviously, it's systematically, it's 5th edition D&D, optimized for video game. Almost everyone at Larian is an RPG fanatic at one level or another. Most of them play tabletops in addition to video games. A lot of these things seem instinctual to us, right? And they may, in some of these lessons, may seem obvious to you. But it's often the obvious lessons that, because they're obvious, you haven't thought about them enough, right? So it's worthwhile to consider, how did those get to be obvious? What I'm going to do is I'm going to run through 6 things. We'll leave a little time, hopefully, for Q&A at the end, and we'll wrap up in time to get us out of here so that the next panel can come in. The first thing was really important to us in BG3, and I think should be in your tabletop campaign, is that role-playing games have got roles in them, right? They're about people. And so the key thing is to establish early that there are emotional stakes to your campaign, right? It's not just there's some ogres and these guys need some heroes to kill them, right? You need to find a way whereby the stakes are a lot more, the motivations are a lot more human and real than that. Stories are about people. They're not about little figures on the tabletop. They're about people, and so you've got to have people in your campaigns. As the GM, make sure that the important NPCs that get face time with your characters are humans who have human problems that they need help solving, because these are really important to them. And these motivations, the more important they are to the NPCs, the more likely that you'll be able to get your player characters to empathize and get involved with them. If possible, in fact, you should try to see if you can weave your player character stories into your NPC stories. Think about what moves you. What are your fears? What are your ambitions? What do you hate? What and who do you love? And that's what your stories need to be about. Things like that. Because when the emotional stakes are high, then your players care. They care about the outcome. It has meaning and significance. And so when they succeed or when they fail, it really hits home. And that's what they remember. Years later, when they talk about the game that you ran, they're going to talk about the emotional high points and low points, because that's what hits hard. Now, there's still, you still got to go fight the ogres. So that adds, working through, acting out the conflicts is what gives the success or failure states that make the emotional stakes matter. So, combat's important. We've all played games where you have a certain, they'll give you bits and pieces of story, and then you go into a combat and you fight 6 ogres, and then you go and you do some more story, and then you fight 6 ogres again. It's especially, for whatever reason, some games are based on grind, and combat gets repetitive. And I'll tell you, I have quit otherwise perfectly good games because I've found the combat systems to become repetitive, and they lose my engagement. When we make combats, we craft every single one to be unique and significant. So there's not necessarily as many combats per hour as you find in other video games, partly because, turn-based game systems, combats take a long time, but also it's because we want every one to be a unique problem that the player has to solve. And if they've already solved that problem 3 or 4 other times in the same way, it's just not interesting. It doesn't engage them, and you can lose their focus and their concentration. And they'll be much happier because what makes them really happy is solving a problem, because then they feel smart and capable. So give them new problems, right? So when you're crafting your campaign, in as much as possible, try to think in advance, especially before each session, right? What are the likely combat scenarios that we're going to have here? And then blue sky it in your head and think, okay, how can I make this an interesting challenge? One of the problems with games like D&D is that you tend to think about setting up a combat, and you look at the combat map and you think about where you're going to put the figures and stuff, and suddenly it's a board game, and it's not about people anymore. It's about plastic figures. So think about the setting, think about the terrain, think about the stakes of the combat. Who's in this? Why are they doing it? What are they likely to do? What can you do with timing and pacing to change it up so that things come in, things come out? There might be attacks, ambushes, retreats, things of that sort. Think about collateral damage, right? It's not just about who's the characters who are in the initiative order. There's other people around, probably, other creatures. At a minimum, there's destructible terrain, and all kinds of weird stuff can happen there. So, take those things into account, and you don't have to use them all just because you've thought it through, because, or you've thought it as potential, because it's just not going to go the way you think exactly, right? But the more you can think about having all these disparate elements in every fight and mixing it up, the more your players are going to have interesting problems to solve, and then they'll feel good about solving them. Now, when you get down to play, it's very likely that your players are going to do something and take a hard right turn and go well away from where you had in your mind set up your elaborately constructed conflict. Fine. That work wasn't wasted. All that ideation was good for giving you puzzle pieces that you can use to construct a combat on the fly, which you're going to inevitably end up doing. So that's not a bad thing. A combat that's constructed on the fly because the players made decisions you didn't expect is still telling their story. And that's what they're there for. So roll with it. In fact, you have an advantage that video game designers don't have. You know your players. you're sitting right there with them. Read the room. Listen to what they tell each other. And steal their ideas. And then pretend that's what you had in mind all the time. Those make great combats. And on that subject, back onto the narrative, we consciously use the idea that we sometimes call fail forward, which is that you have a general idea of which way the story should go, right? Because you got a core story and it's got to progress. But you don't have to progress that story. The players don't have to go through and connect the dots in the order that you laid them down in the road, right? And if they get into a situation and they don't succeed in that situation, in fact, they blow it. They end up having a run, and they don't beat the enemy, and they don't pick up the next clue that you expected them to pick up. That's okay. Because it doesn't really take away the core story. What it does is it puts an interesting challenge on you and your players to get back to it in a different direction. Failure isn't failure. Failure just is a change to the story, and and insofar as it's a result of player choice, as it's a consequence for what they have done or failed to do, that's okay, because they are establishing the story based on their choices. They picked this. This is on them. So let them fail, and the consequences from that are still going to be narratively interesting. What that means for us, making video games, is that we have to assume that our story is not going to be what the players do, because they never do it that way. So it has to be built of a jillion jigsaw puzzles, pieces that can be put together in different combinations, so that you can always fail forward, and you can always advance through the story and the geography that's associated with the story anyway. You, as a tabletop GM, actually have an advantage there, because you can totally make shit up out of nowhere that you hadn't even thought of half an hour before to react to what your players do. You don't have to use pre-made puzzle pieces. And in fact, if you are pushing the players to get back to your pre-made puzzle pieces, you're probably doing it wrong, because you're removing their agency and invalidating their decisions to try to get them back to what you think it ought to be. But you're there to help tell their story. And we'll get back to that toward the end. FaceTime for villains, all right? This is real important. You're going to have the prime movers and shakers behind the bad stuff that your heroes are going to deal with. Your heroes may not even be very heroic, but they're still going to have antagonists. And these antagonists should be, insofar as possible, people who you put a face and a personality to. Put them on the board. Get them out there in front of the players. Give them somebody to relate to that they're opposing, rather than an abstract, distant villain. This puts that emotional stake into the story for them that they didn't have before, because now they know who they hate and they know why. Even better is they may sympathize with your villain, and then you've really got them on the horns of a dilemma. And boy, that really gets emotionally engaging. So find ways to put your villains into the story early, and as often as necessary, to make sure that your players know who their antagonists are. Now, sometimes that means that you're going to put your players into a position where they're face-to-face with their antagonist, or close anyway, and they're going to be tempted to make a really bad decision and just attack that person when it's, not advantageous to do so. Fine. That's their choice. They may go down in flames, but it will be glorious. Okay, so let them do it. Let them be rash. You've got, as a GM, you've got plenty of opportunities to foreshadow that maybe they're making a bad decision, right? But it's their decision. Let them do it. All right. Next mechanic, save and reload. No, you can't do that. We get to do that. You don't get to do that with your players around the table. It's just wrong. However, you can save the day with a reroll. Okay? You can give them a certain amount of control over the way fate is resolved in your game. Because to save and reload is like brutal on the narrative sense, right? On the standpoint. It's something that you can let players choose for themselves, but you never want to do anything like that at the tabletop. You want their decisions to stand. Their decisions should be valid and followed up on, no matter what they are. However, most games have chance resolution mechanics, often dice, sometimes cards, things of that sort. And these are clearly abstract mechanics that ride above the narrative reality of the story. The reality that's in your mind of the story that you are collectively telling with your players. And abstract mechanics, everybody understands, are outside of what's happening here with me and my friends, right? So everybody buys into the fact that you can play with those. It's their tools that for resolution that I mean, they don't occur in our reality, in our day-to-day life. So it's fine to play with them. So, for example, D&D has the mechanic of inspiration points, which players can earn, and this is a limited and party-wide resource that enables players to collectively decide that they're going to expend an inspiration point to change a die roll. And that's okay. It doesn't, it does, it's a little tiny rewind in the narrative, but it doesn't really throw things too awry. And there's lots of different ways that you can do that you can play with those mechanics. They can be individually based. I give out like destiny coins, sometimes at the table for people who do bold and interesting stuff. You can also, depending upon the background of your setting and how your players are wired into it, you might have the capacity to, on some basis, have divine or diabolic intervention occur. And it's usually best if, once again, that is a sort of currency that you give to the players so that they trigger it. You give them the option, but they get to trigger it. You really probably don't want to do a GM-generated Deus Ex Machina. That just never feels good. But if your cleric gets to invoke their deity and get a miracle, that's cool. That's exciting. High-level games, you might even play with time itself a little bit, But once again, that is cool insofar as it's the players who get to choose it at their option. But that's kind of playing with fire, really. Let's see. How are we doing on time? Am I rushing through this? I am rushing through this. We might have a lot of Q&A. Because I got to my final point already. But this is the most important one. So I will ramble on about this for a while. Okay. As the game master, and people do this differently in tabletop games and in video games. There's lots of different approaches to how pre-made the story is. We only like to do that on a sort of general basis and have all of the little stuff that was happening right in front of your face be completely variable insofar as possible. Because the thing that you're doing as a game master and a game designer is what role-playing games are for, is to give people who want to participate in a story the tools to do so, even if, and especially if, they are not themselves storytellers. And this applies to the GM too, to you, right? So players want to feel, they love serial stories, movies, books, manga. They want to be in this. But and they want to, and it's best to do that with your friends. But it's really hard to do if you're not a good storyteller, and you shouldn't expect to be an actor, to be acting when you're not an actor. You shouldn't have to. So, as the game master, you are using the rules as tools to work with your players to craft an ongoing story that is occurring as it happens, all together with their complicity. And what you had in mind for which way it was going to go and what was going to happen, that's great. That's part of your the fun that you have as the game master. But remember, the players are telling the story of themselves. They're the heroes of this story, right? And so you have to be prepared as the creator of the potential story to understand that you're there to give it away. You're there to, if you have to, throw out everything you had in mind, because the players have made different choices. And because you know them, they're your friends, you're right there with them, you can follow along, you can still, keep your hands on the steering wheel, but give it away. That's and the players will appreciate that more than anything, because it makes their choices, it makes their agency meaningful, because the story followed what they decided to do, no matter how outrageous, no matter how goofy, no matter how ad hoc. The story is no less true for them because you all made it up together and it went off in a different direction than if they followed what you had in mind. Now, so if you're using like a pre-published scenario, those are great. They inspire lots of ideas. They give you ideas for story structure. They show you how you can kind of put the pieces out there that the players are going to pick up, and that it'll kind of naturally make a story out of it, right? But don't feel like you have to follow what's written down. If the players go outside the book, put the book away. Now, if you got enough books, maybe you can get them to go into another book. But as long as that's their choice and it works out fine, and it's you can roll with it, that's good. So we've all played RPGs that are essentially a string of story nodes on a line interrupted by combat with hobgoblins, right? Those can be really, really well crafted and highly polished and very entertaining, but they're fundamentally way away from tabletop role-playing roots, and they're not the kind of games we make. We put a whole lot of effort, years of effort, into polish of really tiny possibilities that few people ever see. But the thing is that when you're playing through a game like a Larian game, you may see, it may be 95% of what you see is stuff that's on the main line. And it's stuff you kind of expect to see, and it's the big payoff moments and stuff like that. But 5% of your game may be little stuff that is completely different based upon choices you made that you stumbled into or stumbled out of or stumbled across, and it makes your playthrough and your choices and your story completely unique. And that 5% of the completely unique stuff is like 95% of what's in the game. It's 95% little stuff that most people never see. And to some extent, you do that for replayability. It gets people to want to go back through and make different choices. And the game supports that to the extent that, and because it's got things like dice rolling in it, right? Even if you make the same choices again, you're never going to get the same playthrough. We can't get the same playthrough. But all of that, that 95% of stuff that just a few people see and that most people don't invest in because it's outrageously expensive and it takes a lot of effort, that's what makes it feel yours. So we put that stuff in there to give it away so that it will be your individual story. And so when you're doing, a tabletop game, as I said, you have the advantage of being able to make up anything that comes to mind as it fits, as you go along. But you're still, you may be doing that against the structure that you're getting from something you thought of in advance or from some pre-purchased scenario that you're using. So it can kind of stay within the realms of the structure. Most important is the structure of the players at the table and how they're interacting with each other and what choices they're making. And so, like I said, constantly you read the room, look at the players, keep track of their mood. It's super important because it's all about the emotional engagement and the stakes that we established at the beginning. And their reaction to how the story is going is so much more important than what you had in mind. They won't necessarily be able to articulate why, but they're going to love it a lot more if you let them have the consequences of their own choices, fail forward, and have big emotional moments. as a result. So those are some of the lessons from BG3 that I think are applicable to tabletop games. That matter to me as a GM as well. All right, so we got time for like 15, 20 minutes of Q&A if anybody has any questions they want to ask. Now, let me preface this by pointing out that I am not here as in the capacity of a representative of Larian Studios. Okay, so questions about that kind of stuff are just not going to get answered because that's not what I'm here for. Just she's got the mic. She's gonna hand you the mic, and then you get to talk. That's how it works. Go ahead.
What was your main inspiration for the tabaxi species?
The tabaxi?
Mm-hmm.
So what he's referring to is the race of cat people that are in D&D. Actually, there's a couple of races of cat people in D&D. There's the tabaxi or tabashi, and there's the Rakasta. And they both go back to that original D&D campaign that I had co-run with my friend Tom Moldvay back in the mid-1970s on what came to be known as the Known World and later Mystara. And we had, that was a campaign built on theft. Okay, so one of the things that we had in there as a playable race and as antagonists was the cat race of the Kzinti, based on Larry Niven's science fiction stories. And because why? Because they were cool. So when I was working at TSR on I guess it was Fiend Folio, we were it needed to be fleshed out with some additional. Most of the monsters in that monster book came from British sources, from White Wolf magazine and other British designers. But there was a bunch of things from American modules of the time, and then a bunch of creatures that we just added because we thought we should add them. And so I added the tabaxi because, foolishly enough, at that point, D&D didn't have any cat people in it. What a dumb idea. Clearly they need to have cat people. Everybody loved cat people. Look at the Khajiit in Elder Scrolls. Big fan favorites. So that was the inspiration for why the Tabashi got into D&D. It was no deeper than D&D needs cat people. Who's next? Raise your hand so she knows where to give the mic. Is the mic even working? Are we doing that? Okay, good.
Yeah, so one thing that works, I think, superbly well in video games, but I find odd in role-playing, is our social skills. So obviously in Baldur's Gate 3, they're fantastic for modifying the outcome of some selection you make. But in tabletop, I've always found it weird where someone can make an impassioned plea and then you say, okay, roll for it, whether it's persuasion or intimidation. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on that, basically, on how systems interact with, role play or interpersonal things?
Right. So, social systems are there for the same reason other storytelling systems are, because they enable you to do things you're not good at personally. As you point out, that works superbly well in video games. Everybody buys it. You're making a persuasion or an intimidation roll. It fits in the situation. At the table, it's a little awkward. Absolutely. There's a couple ways that I deal with it personally as a GM. One way is to, if players if a player puts effort into making a social kind of change to the situation, some sort of impersonation, lying, deceit, persuasion, charm. They put effort into it. I just let it work because they thought, they thought this through. They're not good at this. They made an effort. Am I going to have them fail by a dice roll after they went to that trouble to do something they're not good at? Hell no. So I may fuzz this by rolling it myself behind the screen and then ignoring whatever number comes up. So that they, that because dice, rolling the dice, even though it is an abstract gaming mechanism, right, that can seem intrusive, but it's an emotional intensifier. People are holding their breath to see, whether the dice are going to come up high or low. You don't want to lose that. So that's useful. So the other thing I'll do is having people roll dice against a social mechanism like that. I'll have them roll the dice as an indicator that it was a bad idea. So enough said about that, I think. This gentleman here has another question.
The classes, which one would you recommend for?
Okay, so here's the problem. That's not actually amplifying anything, so you got to speak loud.
I would like to multi-class with the Artificer class. Which one would be the best one to go with that?
Okay. So I'm a narrative designer, and you asked a systems question. But I've been a systems designer. The function of multiclassing is not really to kick more ass because you combine things effectively. I mean, sure, that's fine. But really, the whole function of a class system is to enable you to play out the fantasy of that class, right? I'm a ranger, just like Aragorn, that kind of thing. I want to be that kind of person. That's what a class does for you. It gives you a pre-made collection of skills that play to the fantasy that that class embodies. So, if you're multiclassing, you want to pick classes that sound like they would be fun expansions upon the original class, that expand your fantasy of your character. So think about who you are, and think about who you want to be in the game. What collection of skills are you lacking? And multiclass into that. Pick it on that basis. You can always, there's a lot of what's called theory crafting, right? Where you can crunch the numbers to see which classes give you the best additional 3%, here and 7% there. Wow, that's boring. Don't think about that stuff. Think about the story. Think about who you are in the story. It's a role-playing game. Play a role.
Just jumping off the multi-classing. Oh, sorry.
Okay, the other reason to speak loud is that I'm actually half deaf.
Jumping off the multi-classing question, so in a lot of my games, I just completely get rid of the multi-classing requirements, such as specific charisma for multi-classing into a warlock, because a certain patron mightn't care about how charismatic you are. Kind of, what's your opinion on that kind of side of things?
Okay, so first of all, to recapitulate, she's saying that in order to make multi-classing work, she will sometimes waive the rules that are around it for whatever reason. And wanted to know my opinion on that. First of all, work it out with your GM. Whatever your GM and you can work out together is cool, regardless of what's in the book. Second, what we found when adapting 5th edition into a video game, and we got a lot of feedback on this kind of stuff because we were in what's called early access for over 2 years, which is great because it involves a community, and all the ideas that you think are really cool but aren't, you find out really quickly that they're not. Right? So then you get to change them. And also, we started out because we were adapting from 5th edition, right? So, and I say we, of course, but I mean the gameplay team. But they thought, okay, we're coming in here, you know, we're coming off a bunch of games where we had our own rule sets. And it's really hard to make up your own rule set. But this is great. We got it all published. It's all right here. All we have to do is put this stuff in the book into the game. It'll be great, you know. So they did that, and it wasn't great. So, because they found, you know, that a rule set that is written and has been refined over decades to work as a tabletop system, it's probably not the best basis for an animated video game. So, among the things that got changed is that a lot of the requirements based for classing and multi-classing, and a lot of the bonuses and liabilities that came from species or background choices, they got thrown out. They got thrown out because they were limiting the player's choices to enact their character's fantasy. Even if they weren't technically limiting them, it looked like, you know, do I really want to incorporate these minuses? You know, just because I want to be a bard ranger or something. It put a chill on things, right? So we took it out, and ultimately, and this enraged a lot of the rules purists. And they're still not over it. But we just and this has happened like a little bit at first, and then a bunch more, and as we got right up toward release, we just said screw it, and just threw away everything that was holding the players down, and pretty much they thanked us for it. So good. So that's my opinion. I agree. Do what you want.
One of the things I'm really interested in your opinion on is from both a game design perspective, sorry, I'll talk louder,
oh, it's fine.
From like a GM perspective is looking at how to combine the two. So having, one of the things that I've started doing is using like Unity or Twine is creating a session 0.5 where I essentially make like a very basic branching narrative game that works within the start of my campaign to introduce players to things and to learn more about how they play as a character. But with the advancement of technology, and you see like some games using machine learning to have like real-time responses from NPCs and stuff, do you see that being maybe like a way that the sort of sector is going, where you'll see the combination of video game aspects in just like the actual friends around a table real play, where you have almost like mini episodes that are actual games that you would play on a computer paired along with like an in-person campaign and stuff?
Yes. Yes, there's going to be an interpenetration of technology from video games and tabletop games, inevitably. It's and there's just no reason not to take advantage of that, unless your players are uncomfortable with it. right? You have to, your player's comfort level is paramount. So if they like it, fine, do it. If they seize on it and they really like it, do it a lot, and look for ways to expand that and for other things that you can do in that regard. Look for, ways to enable them to play offline between sessions. That's a cool thing to go into. You mentioned machine learning. Machine learning is just, in the computer sense, what GMs do all the time, which is pay attention to what their players want and give them more of it. And look at what they hate and stop doing that. That's a very useful paradigm to follow as well. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
How do you?
Wait for it. Sorry?
Just for the video,
Oh,
so we
thank
have
you.
the audio.
How do you breadcrumb out narrative clues or like important narrative bits without it being sort of too vague that the players don't grasp it, or too specific that it's a bit lore dumpy?
That's art, really. That's because you're walking a line, as you point out, so what we do to make that line wider, so that you get more choices and options and hints and clues that are non-intrusive, is that we give you those hints and clues and things based upon the choices that you've made in your class and your species and the things that you've done previously. These all have tags associated with them, right? So you have a tag for being a drow, and you have a tag for being a bard, and you have a tag for having saved a character in Act 1 who recurs in Act 2 because you saved her. All of these things get tracked at some level. And so then what we do when we're building the story, when we're building the narrative, you build the base. Here's what happens in this situation. Here's the people you meet. Here are the ways that you can interact with them. It can go left, right, center. And then we go back through and you build a game like this layer by layer by layer. It's painstaking. It takes forever. And so then you go back in and you do what we call a reactivity pass on this situation. What if the player's a bard? Well, that makes a difference. How does that make a difference? Well, I'm going to give some this option, or this other approach here, or this clue that you get because you know music. So you do the bard reactivity pass. Then you do the gnome reactivity pass. Right? What if the player's a gnome? Well, then they would. First of all, the NPCs react to you differently because you're a gnome. You know different things because you're a gnome. You can get into small places because you're a gnome that bigger characters cannot. So you figure out the reactivity for being a gnome, right? And then you figure out the reactivity for did I save Anya in Act 1? And if so, what do her friends think of that? What do her enemies think of that? What, by saving her, makes this situation different? So there's that reactivity pass. You do that 100 times. And then you've got a game. And it walks that line, that narrow line between too specific and too vague by adding all of these things to make that line wider so that you have more ways to deal with it. And it feels crafted to you because it's based upon the tags that apply to you. So that's how you do that. That's how we do it anyway.
Here first. I'll come to you next. How long would you spend writing a D&D campaign?
How long did I spend
Writing a D&D campaign.
writing a D&D campaign?
Yeah.
I don't write. I just write an outline, really, you know, and everybody's got a different approach because you have to go with what you're good at, what works for you. I could write them, but I'm just a wordy son of a bitch, so I would never get around to running it. So I just do bullet point outlines, and then I take notes in sessions so that I remember what players have done, you know, and what they liked and what they didn't, so that the next session I can learn from that. And then before every time I run a session, I just schedule time to lie on my bed and stare at the ceiling. And then I just think through what might happen this time. And that could happen. That would be terrible. You know, and then you know, what are all the different, I try to prepare in my mind reactions to things that could happen so that I've got the jigsaw puzzle pieces I need to put the story together on the fly. So that's how I do it. Now, as far as how do I structure a whole campaign? Once again, it's about emotional stakes. It's about how do I figure out what is going to be really important to the NPCs that kick off the campaign and draw the heroes in. And then how's that going to get to be important to the heroes? And then over time, you want to raise the stakes and make them higher and higher. And so you're going to do terrible things to your heroes to get those stakes to go higher, you know, over sessions so that they're continue to be bought into the story that you're telling together. So that's how I do that. Everybody does it differently.
Earlier you mentioned how player characters kind of uniquely at the table can affect your narrative and they can diverge completely, whereas video games, it's harder, or I suppose it can't. When you were building Baldur's Gate 3, did it ever come to pass that the actors that are at the end of the characters ended up, you know, some improv came up with good ideas that now came back into the narrative? And then I suppose also uniquely the early access, did that have any impact on the narrative design?
Okay, so to start with the actors, and one of the things that we did with BG3 that Larian had never done before was full voice capture and motion capture of every line possible, so that our actors had to be, a lot of them had been voice actors who had not really done much motion capture and physical acting, so they had to learn too. But that really put punch into the interactions. And Larian had no cinematic department before they started on BG3. Build it from scratch. Because it's purpose-built to do the exact kind of game we wanted to make. Also, you know, Telltale laid off a bunch of cinematics people right away. So we hired them. To get back to John's point, yes, the actors, especially on the characters that have hundreds of hours of dialogue, you know, and they get into a dialogue themselves with the directors and the writer of the characters, and to the point where they know that character well enough that occasionally, in fact, there is ad-libbed work in the studio that ends up in the game, but not that often. Because there is so much more involved in the presentation of that character's interaction with you than the actors part of it, which is incredibly important. That's why we get such fabulously good actors to do it. But they are supported, and there's going into it, the stuff that they get in advance is already really seriously thought through and written out in our dialogue tool in incredible elaboration. Right? We give them hundreds of lines that they've got to hit. So putting much variation into that is very difficult. And then coming out of it, then it goes to cinematics and audio processing and integration with music and all kinds of other stuff later. So, it's why Larian grew from, over the process of building BG3, grew from under 200 people to over 400 because of all that stuff that needed to be done. So yes, it happens. Not very much, though. You'd be surprised how little. Then the other question was about early access. Yes, early access was a super important tool for figuring out what went across and what didn't. Some characters got completely rewritten, their stories completely redone, their actors recast because what we thought was going to work didn't work with those characters. Yeah, that's extremely useful. Obviously, very labor-intensive and expensive and risky, but you get out of it what you put into it.
We've just 3 minutes left.
Okay, last question then.
Can I ask a question?
Go
So
ahead.
we're in a beautiful stage in time now where gamers have aged and we have young people coming in. So with our wonderful youth club, the players are here and they bring a different perspective and they bring a different energy to games than when I play with experienced older players. And there's such a spectrum of people that play TTRPGs now. How does that inform your work, the different expectations of different age groups?
Well, we aspire to let players do what they want, right? That's kind of our mantra. Wow, that's hard. But when you do that, that means you are inviting people of all different ages, demographics, backgrounds, experiences into the story that you're giving them to try to tell to themselves. And you're trying to make it so that you've got stuff in there for all those different people. So that has a lot to do with why we think about, why we tell ourselves, give it away, right? Because we're not telling the story. I mean, we're making a game that we want to play, right? But we're not telling the story that's about us and that should be about what we want. It has to reach out to people. And they have to look in the possibility space of the game and somehow see themselves in there, no matter who they are. So on that basis, we are constantly thinking about not, how am I going to get my story across here? We're constantly thinking about turning around and looking at it and saying, what does the player want to do here? What would the player want to do? And one of the things that happens a lot at Larian, and this goes all the way up to the Sven Vinke, the creative director and CEO, is that when we're blue skying our way through a situation and figuring out, the narrative possibilities, and somebody comes up with a really far-fetched idea, and somebody else says, yeah, sure, that's impossible. Then we all look at each other and we go, is it? Is it though? I've heard, I've been in meetings with Sven where that exact thing happens, and somebody says, oh, that's not possible, and you can see the wheels turning in his head, right? And then you know what your next assignment is going to be.
out of time.
Okay.
You guys, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.